In this video, I'm going to show you 3 different ways to sew a tube top. For this project, we're going to need pins, measuring tape, thread. I'm going to show you how to do it with 3 different types of elastic. So a picot elastic, a thin elastic, thick elastic, scissors, optional embellishments, and then a stretchy fabric. I wanted to show an example of a tube top that I already have to show the general shape of what you're going to end up with. This top has 2 layers, which we're going to do for one of our 3 variations. We're going to start by pinning the front piece of our top. Pinning it on a mannequin will make it a little easier, but you can absolutely pin it on yourself as well. So we're going to start by just creating the front piece of our top, pinning it at the side seams. It's important that we're pinning straight side seams as we go. Then we can roughly trim away the excess fabric, leaving quite a bit of extra just in case we make any adjustments. Then we're going to roughly trim the length for the top, again leaving quite a bit extra. Now moving on to pinning the back of the top, which is going to be exactly the same as the front, pinning at the side seams, roughly trimming away the excess on the side, and trimming away the excess on the bottom as well. And here you can see I've pinned my seams nice and straight. Now we need to test to make sure we can pull the top over our shoulders to test if we can put it on and off. Now that we're happy with the fit, we can measure our picot elastic. We're going to measure this right above the bust with a comfortable stretch right where we want the top of our top to lie. And we want to leave 2 centimeters extra for seam allowance. Now taking what we just pinned, it looks like there's a nice curve and our pins are evenly placed. But just to make sure, we can fold it in half and cut away any extra fabric that's making the piece not symmetric. Now we're ready to sew our side seams. And we want to do this with a zigzag stitch. Then trim away any extra seam allowance. If your fabric's going to fray, it's a good idea to go over these seams again with a zigzag stitch, this time making sure the needle just pokes off the side of the fabric. This helps to lock in any loose threads. Now it's time to add the picot elastic. I start by overlapping the ends and sewing it into a loop, again using a zigzag stitch. And now we're going to attach it to the fabric. Placing right sides together with the detail end of the elastic facing down, we're going to attach the elastic to the top of our tube top. If the elastic's a little bit smaller than the top, you're just going to have to stretch it a bit as you sew, and we're going to sew that with a zigzag stitch. If any fabric is poking on the other side of the elastic, we're going to have to trim that away. Then we're going to fold our elastic over and do our second zigzag stitch. This is again sewing on the right side of the fabric, so it's more like a top stitch. This is one of my favorite finishes for a stretchy fabric. Now I'm going to add my optional embellishment, which I think is a pretty detail for the top. So I'm just finding the center and then I'm going to hand stitch on the bow. The final step is just to hem the bottom of the top. With a stretch fabric, there's different ways to hem, and I'm going to show you 2 of those techniques. The first is just going to be to fold it over and sew it with a zigzag stitch. And the second, we're going to incorporate an elastic. So starting with just folding our fabric over, we're going to sew with a zigzag stitch right on the end of the seam allowance. And for the second technique, we're going to do exactly what we did with the picot elastic, sewing the elastic on the right side of the fabric, trimming away any of the excess fabric on the outside poking through, folding it over, and then sewing it again with a zigzag stitch. Because we're not using a picot, none of the detail will be showing through and it'll just be the zigzag stitch. I also did it with a straight stitch to show that you can do that as well. In my case, my fabric wasn't fraying, so I left it as a raw edge. And this is the first technique all done. Now moving on to our second tube top technique, starting out by measuring the length we want for the thin elastic. We already created our pattern pieces, so I'm just going to skip that step. But for the second technique, we're going to need 2 front pieces and 2 back pieces. We're going to pin all 4 side seams and sew exactly how we did before with a zigzag stitch. If your fabric frays, you can trim away the excess and sew again with a zigzag stitch to lock in those extra threads. Now we're going to take our 2 layers and attach them right sides together. And then you're going to place pins around the top of your shirt, making sure to align the 2 side seams. And then you're going to sew with a zigzag stitch around the top of your shirt where you placed your pins. Now we have the 2 layers attached. Adding in the thin elastic is a bit of an optional step, but I really like the effect that it has on the top. So I'm just pinning it to the seam allowance and towards the under layer of the tube top. And then you're just going to overlap the elastic on top of itself at the end. We're going to do a zigzag stitch on the inside layer of the fabric that's going to go through the elastic, the seam allowance, and the inside layer of fabric. So you're just going to sew along where you pinned. Now we can flip it so both of our right sides are facing out. For the double layer hem, it's a little different, and we're going to fold both sides in to attach right sides together and pin that from the inside. Another way to look at it is to just pin the right sides together from the inside of the shirt. And you're going to continue to pin this from the inside all around the shirt. You're going to want to leave a gap in your pins so you can flip everything right side out when you're done sewing. Then you're going to sew along where you pinned, remembering to leave that gap unsewn. And you're going to do this with a zigzag stitch. Your elastic strip should run perpendicular to the seam you just sewed. Then you're going to flip everything right side out through the hole that you left open. Then you can pin that hole back up by tucking in the seam allowance. And you can do a small stitch to close it up. And then that's the second tube top technique all done. Now moving on to our final way to sew a tube top. And for this one, we're using the thick elastic. So again, we're going to take the base pattern that we created, and this time we're going to create a second layer that's just going to cover the bust. The length of this second layer is up to you, and you're just going to trace it using the front and back piece of our tube top. You want to make sure that both layers are the same length. So now you have the second layer cut out for the front and the back piece. Now you're going to attach right sides together, the front and the back outside pieces, and then the two smaller pieces that you just created. And then you're going to sew along where you pinned on all four of those seams with a zigzag stitch. Now we're going to attach those two layers together, in the same way that we did for the second technique, placing right sides together and aligning the side seams. And then you're going to sew where you pinned with a zigzag stitch. Then we're going to attach our thick piece of elastic, folding over our seam allowance towards the smaller piece of fabric, pinning through the seam allowance, the elastic, and the small piece of fabric. Then sew with a zigzag stitch, making sure to sew through all of those layers. It's up to you what you decide to do with the hem, but this piece is all done. And there's our third technique for sewing a tube top. You can now decide which of the three works best for you. Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, please subscribe.